The old notebook was the color of creek water after a long rain. Ren Calloway set it on the wooden table in the equipment shed and watched the young man across from her pick it up. The way people pick up things they sense are heavier than they look. He was 23 years old, a graduate student from the agricultural program at Texas A&M, and he had driven 3 hours from College Station with a recorder and a list of questions he no longer seemed interested in asking. He was looking at the notebook way certain people look at things that have survived longer than they were supposed to. Wren was 45 years old. Her hair had gone the color of winter grass at the temples, and her hands showed 45 years of Texas sun and work in every crease and callus. She was sitting on an overturned feed bucket, which was where she had always preferred to sit when she had something important to say. She let the young man hold the notebook a moment longer. Then she said, "Open the back cover." He did. On the inside of the back cover, written in handwriting that had the particular careful quality of a man who had spent his life recording things he did not want to forget, were 5 words. The young man read them. He looked up at her. She said that man wrote those words the year he died. He was 86 years old. He had spent his whole life watching things that other people walk past without seeing. She paused. He taught me that the most important thing on any piece of land isn't the thing you can see. It's the thing that's gone quiet. The young man looked back at the words. Watch the quiet things first. Outside the shed through the open door, the pecan orchard stretched south in long rows toward the property line. The trees were full and heavy now, their canopy so thick the afternoon light broke apart before it reached the ground. Red-tailed hawks moved between the upper branches. An owl already awake in the early evening called once from the far edge of the grove. The orchard had not always looked this way. 23 years ago, it had been dying. And nobody knew it yet. Not her neighbors, not the county extension office, not the bank that held the note on the land, not even Wren herself, who had grown up walking those rows with her father and had known every tree by the sound its leaves made in a south wind. The dying had happened underground in the dark in a way that left no visible mark until it was almost too late. What changed everything had been 40 starving animals that nobody in Hidalgo County wanted. She took the notebook back from the young man. She held it in both hands. She said, "It starts in October 2022. I was 22 years old. My father had been dead for 2 years, and I was 3 days away from losing the only thing he ever left me." The equipment shed was quiet around her. The owl called again, and Wren Calloway began. The October that nearly ended, everything came in the way Texas Octobers come, which is to say without apology and without much change in the temperature. The mesquite along the creek had gone a dull yellow. The cotton in the neighboring fields had already been stripped. The pecan harvest was 3 weeks away, and the Callaway orchard should have been in the final preparations that her father Robert had always called the hardest month of the year. It was not. The bank notice had appeared on the gatepost on a Thursday morning 3 days before the auction. It was folded inside a plastic sleeve, the kind used for documents that need to survive weather. And it was addressed to Wren Calloway, sole surviving heir of the Callaway Agricultural Trust, Hidalgo County, Texas. She had read it standing at the gate with her work gloves still on and a pair of pruning shears in her right hand, and she had read it twice, and then she had folded it back into the plastic sleeve and put it in the pocket of her canvas jacket and walked back into the orchard and spent the next 4 hours working a row of trees that did not need working. She was 22 years old. She was slender and sun-darkened in the way of a person who has worked outside since she was old enough to carry a bucket. Her hair was medium brown with chestnut and gold running through it from years of Texas sun, and she wore it pulled back in a loose, low ponytail with strands coming loose around her forehead and temples by the middle of every morning. Her eyes were the color of sky on a day when a storm is thinking about coming, a pale blue-gray that the light changed according to its mood. There were freckles across her cheeks, in the bridge of her nose. There was always some trace of dirt somewhere on a knuckle or a wrist or the corner of her jaw, the kind that comes from work that can't be done wearing gloves every moment. She wore a red and cream plaid flannel shirt with the collar turned up in the October morning layered under her father's old canvas jacket, a tan and caramel thing that was too big for her by two sizes and had been softened by years until it felt more like a second skin than a garment. Her jeans were faded, almost white at the knees and thighs from kneeling in the orchard. Her boots were the same boots she had worn since she was 19. She looked, if anyone had cared to look, like a young woman who had been given something enormous to carry and was carrying it anyway. Robert Calloway had died in the fall of 2020. He had died the way certain working men die, which is to say, still in the middle of something with a list on the kitchen counter of things that needed doing the following week. He had left behind the orchard, the equipment, the note on the land, and a daughter who knew how every piece of it worked because she had learned it all at his side since she was 6 years old. He had not left behind enough to cover the debt that had been building since the drought years. Wren had spent 2 years doing what she could. She had pruned and irrigated and harvested and sold. She had repaired equipment herself when she could not afford to have it repaired. She had gone without things she did not mention to anyone because there was no one to mention them to. She had made the minimum payments on the banknote for 23 months in a row, and then one August, the pecan price dropped to a level that made the math stop working, and she had missed September and then October, and then the plastic sleeve had appeared on the gatepost, and she had read what was inside it. The livestock auction at Hidalgo County was not something she had planned to attend. She had driven past it on the way to the county extension office, where she had an appointment to talk about emergency agricultural assistance programs, and she had seen the line of trucks and trailers along the road and had felt without deciding to that she should stop. The auction itself was already winding down when she arrived. Cotton prices, equipment, a good quarter horse that went for more than she could think about without her stomach tightening. She stood at the edge of the gravel lot with her hands in her jacket pockets and listened to the voices around her and felt the way you feel when you are in a crowd, but the crowd is not yours when the conversations moving around you belong to other people and other concerns and other futures. Then she heard the sound from behind the abandoned feed warehouse. Not loud, weak, a low sound that had nothing aggressive in it, a sound that was the opposite of a threat. She turned and walked toward it the way a person walks towards something they already know they will not be able to leave alone. The trailer was backed against the warehouse wall, out of sight from the main auction area. It was a heavy livestock hauler double axle, and it had been through weather and distance and looked as though neither had been kind to it. The steel walls were pitted with rust. The ventilation holes along the upper panel were dark with age. Through the nearest ventilation hole, a pair of eyes watched her stop. The smell reached her a moment later. Hunger has its own smell. It is different from the smell of sickness and different from the smell of dirt. It is the smell of a body that has been burning through its own reserves for too long. Dry and close and wrong in a way that is difficult to describe, but impossible to misread once you have smelled it. Wren stood 12 feet from the trailer and breathed in and did not move. A county wildlife officer was talking to another man near the rear gate. She caught pieces of what he was saying. Private wildlife park, closed 2 weeks ago. 40 animals, honey badgers. Nobody wants the liability. Licensed sanctuaries full. Zoos declined. She heard the sentence he did not finish, and she knew what the unfinished part said, because she had heard adults leave sentences unfinished in exactly that way her whole life, in the context of animals and farms and things that cost too much to keep and too much to move. She walked to the rear of the trailer. She leaned toward the ventilation holes. Inside in the low light, she could see shapes moving, some of them barely. The animals were not pacing. They were not throwing themselves at the walls or scratching at the steel. They lay where they had settled, some together and some apart, and the ones that were moving were doing so with the careful economy of creatures that have learned to spend their energy only on what absolutely requires spending it. One of them was closer to the ventilation panel than the others. It looked at her. It did not look angry. It looked the way a person looks after they have been holding on for a very long time and have finally stopped expecting rescue. The county wildlife officer folded his clipboard shut. She turned to face him. She said, "What would it take to foster them?" The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough for a man standing 20 feet away to hear the question and start laughing. The man's name was Dale Sutton. He was in his mid-50s, built like a person who had been physically imposing in his 30s and had kept the frame without the muscle. He wore the clothes of a working contractor, but wore them too cleanly, the way a person wears a costume of a thing they want people to believe they are. He had been at the auction for reasons he had not shared with anyone near him, and he had been watching Wren since she crossed the gravel lot with the particular attention of a person who has a file somewhere with someone's name on it. He laughed loudly and without trying to make the laughter polite. A second man joined him, then a third. Someone said, "Lady, you can't even save your own orchard." More laughter. Wren did not look at Dale Sutton. She looked at the wildlife officer who was trying to decide whether she was serious and was arriving reluctantly at the conclusion that she was. He said, "You understand these aren't pets." She said, "I know." He said, "They're one of the toughest animals on Earth. They'll require reinforced holding areas, permits, inspections, veterinary supervision." She said, "I know." He looked at her boots. He looked at the old Ford pickup parked at the edge of the lot. He said, "Why would you even ask?" Wren looked past him, past the trailer, past the warehouse wall, in the direction of the pecan orchard that was 6 miles south of where she was standing and that had a foreclosure notice posted on its gate. She said, "I think my land needs something." Dale Sutton laughed again. He said across the gravel loud enough for everyone to hear, "What your land needs is money." The laughter spread in the easy way laughter spreads when a crowd is willing to be entertained. One man did not laugh. I was standing slightly apart from everyone else, near an old stock trailer that was hitched to an equally old truck. He was tall and thin, in the way a man goes thin after 80, and he was leaning on a walking stick made of cedar that had been polished smooth over so many years of use that the wood had taken on the sheen of something carved rather than grown. His hands on the stick were spotted and creased with age. His face was the face of a man who had spent the majority of his life outdoors and had paid in weathering for every year of it. He said nothing. He simply looked at Wren with the particular attention of a person who has learned over a very long life to notice the things most people dismiss. His name was Amos Crofton. He was 86 years old. I had been a wildlife rehabilitator for 40 years before he retired, and before that he had been a ranch hand, and before that he had been a boy who collected things from creek beds and kept them in jars on a windowsill because he wanted to understand what made them work. His permits had expired years ago. He came to livestock auctions out of habit, the habit of a man who has been watching animals and land for 60 years and cannot seem to stop even when there is nothing left for him to do about what he sees. I waited until the laughter had done what it wanted to do. Then he said quietly to no one in particular, "Sometimes hungry animals notice things full stomachs ignore." He said it the way old men sometimes say things without directing the words at anyone, as though he is thinking out loud in a room he believes to be empty. But the words carried the way words do when they are said in exactly the right register, and Wren heard them, and they went into her the way certain things go in and do not come back out. She looked at the wildlife officer. She said, "Where do I sign?" Dale Sutton had his phone out of his pocket before she had finished writing her name on the first page of the emergency care agreement. She saw him from the corner of her eye, stepping away toward the edge of the gravel, his back to the group. She could not hear what he said into the phone. She did not need to. The paperwork was 30 pages long. It contained conditions that were, in the opinion of the county wildlife officer, almost impossible for a single person to meet on a working farm with limited infrastructure and no prior permit history. Double fencing, daily inspection logs, veterinary oversight, state monitoring. Failure to comply on any single condition meant immediate removal of the animals. She signed every page. The convoy that followed her home contained 2 reinforced transport trucks, a county wildlife vehicle, and a pickup driven by Amos Crofton, who had not been invited but had simply pulled in behind the others, the way old men sometimes do things without asking permission and without explaining themselves. Dale Sutton's vehicle drove past the convoy going the other direction before it left the county road. He did not slow down. Word had reached Hidalgo County before the convoy did. By the time Wren pulled through the gate at the Callaway place, Three neighbors had parked along the fence line, not close enough to be obviously watching, but not far enough away to be doing anything else. Children counted vehicles. Adults counted fences. Rufus Van, who owned the larger pecan operation on the land adjoining Wren's property to the west, and who had known her father for 30 years, stood at his own fence line with his arms folded and a look on his face that combined concern with the particular satisfaction a man sometimes feels when he suspects he is watching a mistake being made. He called over the fence when Wren stepped out of her truck. He said, "Your daddy always said you had more nerve than sense." She said he was usually right. Rufus unfolded his arms and refolded them. He said, "Those things bite through steel cable. I read about them." She said, "I know." He said, "They'll tear through your fencing in a week." She said, "I'm doubling the fence." He looked at her for a moment, the way people look at someone who has said something that is both unreasonable and against all the available evidence, possibly true. Then he shook his head and walked back toward his own house and left her to what she was doing. The transport convoy backed up the service road beside the equipment barn. The animals came off the truck slowly. Some of them walked. Some had to be assisted in their crates. They were small, most of them, in the way that animals whose reputation vastly exceeds their size are always smaller in person than you expect. But there was something in the way they moved, even in this state, even weakened and disoriented, and far from any landscape they recognized that made the people watching them watch carefully. A low alertness, a quality of attention, as though each animal was processing more information than it appeared to be processing. Wren stood at the entrance to the temporary enclosure and watched them move inside. Amos Crofton stood beside her. He had not introduced himself, and she had not asked his name. There are people you meet in the middle of something and whose names seem less important than what they are there to do, and Amos was one of those. He watched the animals. He said, "They're not as far gone as I expected." She said, "The county said they'd been in the trailer 4 days." He said, "4 days is bad, but their eyes are clear. They've been rationing whatever they had." He was quiet for a moment. Animals that have learned to ration don't forget how. That's either very good or very useful, depending on what you need from them. She looked at him. She said, "What do I need from them?" He did not answer immediately. He looked at the animals moving carefully through the enclosure, sorting themselves, finding corners, establishing the invisible arrangements that animals establish whenever they are put together in a new space. Then he looked out past the enclosure toward the south end of the property, toward the oldest section of the pecan orchard. He said, "I don't know yet, but I'd like to come back tomorrow morning if that's all right with you." She said it was. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he is filing something away, and he walked back to his old truck and drove away without ceremony. That evening, after the county transport vehicles had gone and the veterinary team had conducted its intake assessment, and the last of the paperwork had been filed and photographed and emailed to the addresses on the compliance sheet, Wren sat on the tailgate of her truck and looked at the enclosure in the gathering dark. 40 animals. 40 animals that nobody wanted. The irony of that was not lost on her. She was sitting on land that a bank was preparing to take, watching animals that a county was prepared to destroy, and the two situations had a symmetry that she could feel but not yet articulate. She was 22 years old. She was 3 days past the foreclosure notice, and she had just signed her name to 30 pages of conditions that would require a level of labor and organization that she was not entirely certain she could provide. And she had done it on the basis of a sound she heard through a rusted ventilation panel and the quiet remark of an old man she had never met. She thought about calling someone. There was no one to call. Her mother had moved to San Antonio 5 years ago, and they spoke on holidays. She had two friends from high school who were both living in Houston and could not have located Hidalgo County on a map without looking it up. There was no one who knew this land the way she knew it, who understood what it meant to her in the specific and complicated way that a piece of land means something to the person who has grown up on it. She sat on the tailgate. The night came in. The pecan trees to the south became a dark mass against a darker sky. She noticed for the first time how quiet the orchard was. Not quiet the way an orchard is quiet at night, which is a specific kind of quiet that includes the small sounds of nocturnal things moving through the understory. Quiet the way a room goes quiet when something that was supposed to be there is not there anymore. She could not remember the last time she had heard an owl in those trees. She could not remember the last time she had heard anything much in those trees. She sat with that thought for a while, uncomfortable with it, in the way you are uncomfortable with a realization that has arrived after the moment when it would have been most useful. She went inside eventually. She ate something standing at the sink. She went to sleep in the room that had been her room since childhood, with her father's canvas jacket hung on the peg by the door. Amos Crofton arrived before dawn. She was already awake. She had not slept well. She was standing in the enclosure checking water levels when she heard his truck on the gravel and saw his headlights sweep the equipment barn wall. I was carrying a dented canvas bag and a notebook that was old enough that the cover had separated from the spine along the bottom edge and had been repaired with electrical tape. He walked to the enclosure without greeting her the way a person walks toward what they came to see, and he stood at the fence line and watched the animals in the early morning dark. Wren stood beside him. After a time, one of the animals began its morning circuit. She had noticed it the previous evening during the intake process, but had attributed it to stress behavior, the kind of repetitive motion that traumatized animals sometimes exhibit. But watching it now in the calm of an early morning, she understood that it was not stress. It was deliberate. The animal moved along the perimeter of the enclosure in a specific pattern, always clockwise, pausing at intervals that were not random. It stopped at the southeast corner. It stood there for almost 2 full minutes. Its face was oriented toward the pecan orchard. Amos watched this and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Does it do that every morning?" Wren said, "This is the second morning, yesterday evening too." He said, "Always that corner." She said, "Always." He said, "It isn't smelling food." She said, "What is it smelling?" He did not answer. Instead, he walked away from the fence line toward the fence line between the enclosure and the orchard. He walked at the pace of a man who has learned that pace and attentiveness are more valuable than speed. About halfway to the orchard, he stopped. He crouched down. The crouching took him a moment the way crouching takes a man of 86 who is doing it anyway. He scooped up a handful of soil from the ground between the fence line and the first row of pecan trees. He rubbed it between his palms. He brought his hands close to his face and looked at what he held. Then he turned his hands over and let the soil fall. He looked toward the oldest section of the orchard. He said, "The ground shouldn't be this empty." She said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I mean, there is nothing living in this soil, not at the depth it should be at, not the organisms that ought to be here." He stood slowly, brushing his hands against his pants. Healthy orchard soil has a sound to it, not a sound you hear, a quality, a density. He looked at the ground near his boots. "This doesn't have it." She said, "The trees look fine." He said, "Trees lie. They spend a long time looking fine before they don't." She was quiet. He said, "When did the coyotes stop crossing the creek?" She thought about it. She said, 6 months ago, maybe 7. He said, "Before that, the hawks." She thought about it. She said, "Spring." He said, "Before that, the owls." She did not answer because she could not remember the last time she had heard an owl in the orchard, and the not remembering suddenly felt like an important failure of attention. Amos looked at her. He said, "Something pushed them out. Predators don't leave productive ground voluntarily. They leave when the food source leaves or when something below changes what the food source does." He paused. "Your orchard has been losing its underground life for at least a year. Whatever is happening beneath these trees has been happening long enough to reorganize the behavior of every animal that depends on this land." He said it without alarm. He said it the way a doctor says something difficult, with the specific calm of a person who believes that accurate information, however hard, is more useful than comfortable uncertainty. She looked at the orchard. The trees were full. Their canopy was intact. The leaves were the right color. From any reasonable distance, the orchard looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. It looked the way it had always looked. It looked the way her father had kept it for 30 years. But she thought about the silence. She thought about the spring without hawks and the summer without coyotes. And all the evenings she had sat on the porch and heard nothing from the trees and had registered it as ordinary. It had not been ordinary. It had been a symptom. Amos said, "I'd like to come back again tomorrow if that's still all right." She said it was. He said before he left, "Watch the enclosure in the evenings, especially that animal. See where it orients itself." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because hungry animals notice things full stomachs ignore." He paused. "I said that yesterday. I'll say it again because it's still true." He walked back to his truck. The compliance inspections began 4 days later. Brenda Garland was the state wildlife inspector assigned to the Callaway case, and she arrived on a Tuesday morning in an official vehicle with a clipboard that was, as she mentioned more than once, comprehensively filled out. She was in her 50s, a woman who had the particular weathered competence of someone who has spent her career doing difficult technical work in difficult outdoor conditions, and she wore it comfortably without apology. She had inspected, as she mentioned, while walking the perimeter of the enclosure with wren, bears, wolves, mountain lions, escaped zebras from a private facility in Medina County, and once memorably, a reticulated python whose owner had dramatically underestimated its length and weight. She had not inspected honey badgers. The inspection took 4 hours. It covered fence height and anchor depth feeding records, water quality drainage, emergency containment protocols, veterinary supervision arrangements, and 17 categories of record-keeping requirements that Wren had organized into a binder the night before with her grandfather's label maker and more coffee than she could accurately account for. Brenda signed the temporary approval papers at the end of the 4 hours. She said, standing at the gate, "You've done better than I expected." Beyond the gate at a distance that was far enough to be uninvolved, but close enough to hear, Dale Sutton stood with two other men in the shadow of a large pickup truck. He had been there for most of the inspection, moving around the perimeter of the property with the specific restlessness of a person who is waiting for something to go wrong and is getting impatient. He said loudly enough to carry, "Give it another week." Laughter from the two men beside him. Wren was tightening a loose gate hinge with a socket wrench. She kept tightening it. She did not look up. Brenda looked at him for a moment, then at Wren. She said, "What is his actual interest here?" Wren said, "He wants the land." Brenda said, "Your land." She said, "Mine and anything adjacent that becomes available." Brenda looked at Dale Sutton again. Then she looked at her clipboard and made a note she did not explain. She said, "Keep the records clean. I'll be back in 2 weeks." She left. Dale Sutton left shortly after, with a last look at the orchard that was in its length, in its quality, the look of a man taking inventory. Amos came every morning. In the first week, he mostly watched. He watched the animals. He watched the soil at the fence line. He watched the sky over the orchard. He carried his notebook and wrote things in it with a pencil, unhurried the way a man writes when he has been writing things down for 50 years and trusts that the act of recording is its own form of understanding. On the 8th day, he knelt beside the fence and pressed his ear to the ground. Wren was checking the eastern run when she saw him do it. She crossed the enclosure. She said, "What are you doing?" He held up one hand the way you hold up a hand to ask for silence, and she was quiet. He stayed that way for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he stood and said, "I can hear movement." She said, "Gophers." He shook his head slowly. She said, "What then?" He said, "Too much movement for gophers, not the sound of individual animals, the sound of a system." She said, "I don't know what that means." He said, "Neither do I yet, but I'd like to look at some old maps." The county archives were in a building that smelled of paper and old air conditioning, in the particular institutional quietness of rooms that have housed important records for so long that the importance has settled into the walls. The clerk was a man who had worked there long enough that he moved through the stacks with his eyes half closed, pulling files the way a person pulls books they have read and remembered. Wren spread the survey drawings across the wooden table. Her orchard was smaller on these maps than it was in her memory. The property lines were in different places. The contour lines showed the land as it had been before leveling. She traced the drainage pattern with her finger following the old creek bed that had been rerouted in the 1970s. Then she saw the line she had not seen before. It was narrow, faint. It crossed the property from the northwest corner to the southeast corner, passing beneath what was now the oldest section of the pecan orchard. She said, "What is this?" The clerk leaned in. He adjusted his glasses. He said, "Looks like an abandoned irrigation pipeline." She said, "Connected to what?" He said, "Probably the community pumping station." These were common in the 30s and 40s, cooperative water systems. A lot of them were decommissioned when the municipalities built their own infrastructure. She said, "When was this one removed?" He looked at the notation in the corner of the map. He read it twice. He said, "According to these notes, it wasn't." She looked at the faded blue line running beneath her father's orchard. A pipeline, still in the ground, running through the oldest part of the property. She thought about what Amos had said. She thought about too much movement. She rolled up the maps and thanked the clerk and drove back to the Callaway place at a speed that she would later honestly describe as excessive. She found Amos at the fence line between the enclosure and the orchard where she had found him most mornings. She spread the maps on the hood of her truck and showed him the line. He looked at it for a long time. He said, "I need to check something." He went to his truck and came back with a metal rod about 3 feet long with a T-bar handle. He said, "My father used one of these. Soil probe. Simple." He walked to the base of the oldest pecan tree in the nearest row. He pushed the rod into the ground. It stopped halfway. He pulled it out. He moved 3 feet. He pushed again. Stopped halfway. He moved 3 more feet in the direction of the faint survey line on the map. Pushed. Stopped. He crouched and examined the end of the rod where it had stopped. He said, "This isn't rock." She said, "What is it?" He said, "The resistance is wrong for rock. Rock stops a probe clean. This is stopping it dirty, like something partly hollow." He looked toward the oldest grove along the line that the survey map had drawn in blue ink 70 years ago, like something that isn't solid anymore. The night it started was the 11th day. She had been watching the enclosure in the evenings as Amos had asked, and she had noted that the animal that walked the perimeter every morning had begun at dusk to orient itself differently. Not toward the south in the old orchard, toward the east, toward the drainage ditch at the far edge of the property 200 yards beyond the enclosure's eastern fence. On the 11th evening, she noticed that the animal was not alone. They had all moved, all 40 of them. No sound, no signal she could identify. They had simply at some point in the late afternoon migrated to the eastern side of the enclosure and arranged themselves facing the same direction. She stood at the fence and watched them. They were not looking at food. They were not looking at each other. They were looking at something she could not see in the direction of the drainage ditch that she had largely ignored since she inherited the property because it seemed like the least important thing on a property with considerably more pressing concerns. She watched them watch it. And then, in the quiet of a Texas October evening, with the pecan canopy dark against the fading sky and the distant cotton fields already stripped and bare, she heard something she had not heard before. Not from above the ground. From below it, a hollow sound, not loud, not dramatic. The kind of sound that you can convince yourself you didn't hear if you want to. A sound like something vast and quiet, shifting itself in the dark beneath your feet. The oldest tree in the orchard was 40 yards away. She was looking at it when the sound came. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. After it stopped, every animal in the enclosure remained perfectly still. She waited for one of them to move. None of them did. The November rain came at midnight, not the gentle kind, the kind that arrives in Texas like it means to stay heavy and close and with a wind behind it that puts it sideways before it hits the ground. Wren woke to it against the window glass and lay in the dark for a full minute before she got up, because she had learned that there are kinds of weather you assess before you react to them, and kinds of weather that require you to be already moving. This was the second kind. She pulled on her boots and her canvas jacket over her sleep clothes and went outside with a flashlight because the power to the exterior lights had tripped when the wind came through. The enclosure was intact. She walked the perimeter with the flashlight, checking anchors and bottom clips, and the drainage channel she had dug along the eastern run to carry water away from the fence line. The water was moving where it was supposed to move. She was at the northwest corner when she saw the gap. Not a torn panel, not a broken anchor. A gap at ground level where the heavy rain had washed out a section of the drainage trench and created a space beneath the lowest rail that was, she estimated by the flashlight's beam, just large enough. She counted the animals by flashlight. She counted 39. She stood in the rain and counted again. Still 39. One of them was gone. She did not panic. Panic was something she had trained herself away from in the 2 years since her father died, because there had been so many moments that invited it, and she had learned that the moments which invited panic most urgently were also the moments that most required its absence. She secured the gap first. Then she called Amos. He answered on the second ring. At nearly 1 in the morning. She had not thought about what time it was. She told him what had happened. He said, "Which one?" She said, "The one that walks the perimeter." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What direction was it facing last?" She said, "East, the drainage ditch." He said, "Don't search in the dark. Wait for first light. If it went where I think it went, it'll still be there in the morning." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because if I'm right about what it sensed, it went toward it, not away from it, and what it sensed isn't going anywhere." She stood in the rain for another hour, unable to follow this advice, before she accepted that he was probably right and went back inside. In the morning, Brenda Garland arrived 40 minutes after Wren called her. She arrived with a containment kit in a form and the particular expression of a person who has been through enough of these situations to know that they are rarely as simple as they appear to be. But before she had gone 50 yards from her vehicle, she stopped. She looked at what was in front of her. She said, "That's not a gopher mound." 212 yards east of the enclosure's fence line, at the edge of the drainage ditch that Wren had largely ignored, a mound of earth rose from the ground that was in diameter larger than any pocket gopher colony had a reasonable right to produce. The soil around it was disturbed in an area of 40 or 50 square feet. Fresh tracks covered the mud in and around the ditch. In the center of the disturbed area, sitting with its face pointed back toward the orchard, was the missing animal. It looked at Wren. She looked at it. Brenda looked at both of them. She said quietly, "Miss Calloway, I think we need to talk about what's underneath your land." But Brenda Garland also had a form to fill out. She had a protocol to follow and a compliance condition to enforce. And the compliance condition was clear, and the 30 pages Wren had signed were clear. And so Brenda did what she was required to do, which was to retrieve the animal and issue a 48-hour suspension notice and make a note in the record. Dale Sutton arrived 20 minutes later. He had not been called. He stood outside the gate with a yellow legal pad and a pen and the look of a man who has been waiting for something and believes it has finally arrived. Wren sat on the step of her truck in the damp morning with her hands wrapped around a thermos of coffee that was already cold. She watched Brenda finish the paperwork. She watched Dale Sutton write things on his legal pad. She watched the recovered animal settle back into the enclosure with the others. Then she looked down at the canvas bag that Amos had left at the property the previous day when he had gone home to retrieve something. He had not picked it up. Inside the bag was the old notebook. She opened it. She turned to the front page, and she stopped. At the top of the front page, in the same careful handwriting that ran through the whole notebook, was a date. And below the date was a name. The date was 1998. The name was Robert Calloway, her father's name. She sat on the step of her truck in the cold morning with the notebook in her hands and the 48-hour notice in her jacket pocket, and Dale Sutton writing things on a legal pad 30 yards away, and she did not move for a long time. She was 22 years old. She was holding something that had been kept for her for 24 years by a man she had met 3 days ago. She did not yet know what it meant. But she knew with the specific certainty that comes to some people in some moments that what she was holding was not the beginning of the story. It was the middle of one that had started before she was born. The notebook smelled of cedar and old pencil shavings, And something else she could not identify, a dry mineral smell that she associated later with the specific quality of patience that belongs to people who have spent long years in the outdoors learning to wait for things that move at their own pace. She sat on the truck step for a long time after she found her father's name. Dale Sutton finished his notes and drove away. Brenda Garland's vehicle turned onto the county road and disappeared. The morning went on without them, the way mornings do, indifferent to what the people in it have just discovered. Wren turned the pages one at a time. The notebook was not organized in the way most notebooks are organized. It was not chronological. It was not indexed. It was the record of a mind that moved between observation and reflection, without distinguishing between them, the way a person thinks when they have stopped worrying about what their thinking looks like and have started trusting it to go where it needs to go. There were entries about pocket gophers, about soil composition at various depths, about the relationship between the presence of a specific burrowing owl species and the health of underground root systems in the Tamaulipan thorn scrub. There were pages covered in what appeared to be elevation sketches of the county drawn in pencil from memory with annotations about water movement. And then there were the pages from 1998. They were not labeled. They did not announce themselves. But the handwriting in that section was slightly different from the rest, the way a man's handwriting changes when he is writing down something that matters to him in a particular way, with a care that is less about neatness and more about wanting to get the thing exactly right. The first entry from that period read, "Visited the Callaway pecan operation this morning. Robert Callaway, 51 years old, third-generation grower. He came to me through the county extension network. He'd been losing production in the northeast quadrant for 2 seasons. The trees look healthy. He knows they look healthy. He's not asking me why the trees look unhealthy. He's asking why the land has gone quiet." Wren read that sentence twice. He's asking why the land has gone quiet. She looked up from the notebook at the pecan orchard in front of her. Her father had stood in this orchard 24 years ago and asked the same question she was now asking, and had known enough to ask it of the right person, and had walked away from that conversation with an answer he never got to use. She kept reading. Amos had written about 3 visits to the Callaway property in the fall of 1998. He had written about walking the fence lines with Robert, about pressing his ear to the ground, the way he had pressed it to the ground of this same land 4 days ago, about finding the same absence of underground life, the same wrong quality in the soil. He had written a sketch of a solution: partial restoration of predator presence in a controlled corridor, management of the gopher population through natural means, identification and sealing of the underground pathways that were allowing the colony to spread beneath the root systems. He had drawn a map of the property with zones marked in pencil. He had written at the bottom of the map one sentence. The sentence read, "This will require someone with patience for the long work. Robert says his daughter will have it." His daughter. She had been 2 years old in 1998. Her father had stood in the orchard with a man he had just met and had said to that man that his 2-year-old daughter would have the patience for the long work. And then he had died when that daughter was 20 years old, and the long work had not been begun, and the land had kept going quiet, tree row by tree row, owl by owl, hawk by hawk, in the years that followed. And now here she was sitting on the step of a truck with a 48-hour suspension notice in her pocket, and her father's name in an old man's notebook, and 40 starving animals in an enclosure on the other side of the equipment barn. She closed the notebook. She held it with both hands for a moment. Then she put it carefully in the canvas bag and set the canvas bag on the passenger seat of her truck, and she went to find Amos. I was not at home when she drove to the address she found through the county extension network, a small property 8 miles north of the Callaway place. A modest house with a cedar tree in the front yard, and a truck that had been old when she was born parked in the gravel. But there was a note on the door in the same careful handwriting she now recognized. The note said, "Wren, I went to look at something. I'll come to you. Wait for tomorrow morning." She drove home. The 48 hours passed the way difficult hours pass, which is to say slowly and in segments that feel longer than they are. She maintained the enclosure. She kept the logs. She called the veterinary supervisor and updated the records. She walked the fence line twice in the afternoon and once in the early evening. She did not walk the orchard. She did not know yet that the orchard was running out of time. Amos arrived at first light on the second day. He came with a woman. Wren had not met a woman in her early 40s who drove a Texas A&M extension vehicle and moved with the specific, purposeful energy of a person who has been handed an interesting problem and is approaching it with genuine enthusiasm rather than professional obligation. Her name was Dr. Cassie Pruitt. She taught in the agricultural engineering program. She had brought in the bed of the extension vehicle a piece of equipment that Wren did not recognize. Dr. Pruitt said, ground penetrating radar, GPR. She said it the way people in their professional lives sometimes say the names of their tools with the mild pride of someone who trusts what they work with. It sends radar waves into the soil and reads the reflections. Different materials reflect differently. Air pockets, water-buried structures, organic material, they all show up differently on the monitor. She set the equipment up on the south side of the enclosure fence. She said most people think of soil as solid ground. It's not. Healthy soil is full of small spaces, water moving through it, air, root systems, insects, fungi, living things. When something unnatural interrupts those layers, a buried pipe, a collapsed tunnel, compacted earth, the radar sees it. Wren looked at the equipment. She said, "What made you come out here?" Amos said, "I called her." Dr. Pruitt said he described what he'd found with the probe, the resistance pattern at a regular depth following a straight line. That's not natural. Natural geology doesn't give you a consistent obstruction at 2 feet following a straight course under an agricultural property. She looked at Amos. "You said you thought it was a buried pipe." Amos said, "I said I thought it was something that used to be a pipe." Dr. Pruitt ran the first scan along the fence line between the enclosure and the oldest section of the orchard. She ran it slowly, watching the monitor, and Wren walked beside her and watched the monitor, also trying to read what was appearing on the screen in the same way she tried to read the face of a thing she did not yet fully understand. The first scan showed the pipeline. It was clear and unmistakable, a straight line running beneath the property at a consistent depth. The old irrigation infrastructure from the 1940 survey maps made visible by the radar in a way that the survey maps themselves had only hinted at. Dr. Pruitt zoomed in on the area around the pipeline. She said, "Look at these." Around the pipeline at irregular intervals were shapes that were darker on the monitor than the surrounding soil. Not the clean geometric darkness of the pipeline itself. Irregular, organic. The shapes of spaces that had formed gradually over time through repeated disturbance rather than deliberate construction. Wren counted them. She lost count at 30. Dr. Pruitt said, "These are hollow. There shouldn't be this many underground chambers in an orchard." Wren said, "Animal tunnels." Dr. Pruitt said, "Yes, but look at the way they're connected." She traced the path on the monitor with her finger. The pocket gopher colonies haven't just dug tunnels. They've used the abandoned irrigation corridor as a highway. Over years, the pipeline gave them a ready-made passage at consistent depth, and they branched off it in every direction. She paused. "These branches go directly beneath the root system of every mature tree in this section." Wren looked at the screen. She understood before Dr. Pruitt said the next part, what the next part was. Dr. Pruitt said it anyway. She said the root systems aren't resting on solid soil. They're resting across a network of tunnels that have been expanding for years, possibly decades. She looked at Wren. If enough of these tunnels collapse at once, which is what happens when they get large enough and the roof becomes too thin to hold the weight above it, the root structure loses its anchoring. She was quiet for a moment. "We're not talking about losing production. We're talking about losing trees." The orchard was not dying slowly. The orchard had been dying for years at a rate that had simply not yet reached the surface, the way certain things fall before anyone above can see them falling. Wren stood between the equipment and the oldest pecan grove and looked at the trees that her father had tended and his father before him. and felt something settle in her that was not peace and not acceptance, but something closer to the specific clarity that arrives when a thing you have been unable to name for a long time finally gets its name. Amos was standing slightly apart as he usually stood watching the trees rather than the equipment. He said without turning, "How long has this been building?" Dr. Pruitt said, based on the tunnel diameter and the depth of the oldest branching points, we're looking at 15 to 20 years of active colonization, possibly longer. She looked at the monitor again. Someone would have needed to know the pipeline was here for the gophers to have used it this systematically. The colony found it and stayed with it. Amos said, or something pushed them toward it. Dr. Pruitt said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Pocket gophers don't typically colonize in this kind of density. In healthy ground with active predation, they stay dispersed. You'd see isolated colonies, not a connected network." He was quiet for a moment. Something changed the equation 15 or 20 years ago. Something reduced the predation pressure enough for the population to expand beyond the normal threshold. He looked at Wren. He did not say anything else. She thought about her father and about a notebook with her father's name in it, and about the hawks that had been leaving the orchard for years, one species at a time, and about the owls she could no longer hear in the evenings, and about the long list of things that had changed so gradually that none of them had registered as change, only as the ordinary texture of a place she had grown up in and assumed she understood. She said, "Can we stop it?" Dr. Pruitt looked at the monitor. She said the tunnels can be collapsed naturally if the predation pressure on the gopher population is restored and sustained over a long enough period. Once the gopher numbers drop below a certain threshold, the tunnel maintenance fails. The tunnels fill with water and soil. The root systems reestablish contact with stable ground. She paused. But that process takes time. And in the meantime, we need to make sure no major collapse events happen in the critical zones. Amos said, "What would the major collapse look like?" Dr. Pruitt said, "The soil above a tunnel network of this density would subside. You'd see depressions at the surface. Then sections of root structure would snap under their own weight. Once a tree loses its primary anchoring, it doesn't recover." Wren said, "How close are we to that?" Dr. Pruitt did not answer immediately. She ran another scan. She looked at what the second scan showed. Then she said, "Run the second scan again. I want to see the eastern readings." The second scan showed something that the first scan had not shown clearly enough to interpret with confidence. The gophers were not stationary. Dr. Pruitt zoomed to the eastern section of the scan, the area between the enclosure and the drainage ditch, 200 yards away, and in that area the underground spaces were larger and more numerous and showed a specific pattern of disturbance that was, she explained, consistent with rapid recent excavation rather than the gradual years-long process visible in the older sections. She said, "They're moving. The population in the eastern section is actively relocating." Wren said, "Relocating where?" Dr. Pruitt said, "Away from the orchard, east toward the drainage ditch." She studied the screen. "The density in this section has dropped significantly. The oldest tunnels here are showing fill. The newer excavations are all oriented east." Amos said, "They're leaving." Dr. Pruitt said, "Yes." Wren said, "Why would they leave?" The silence that followed lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Amos said, "Because something below them is failing." He said it without drama. He said it the way he said most things, as a fact rather than a revelation. Dr. Pruitt looked at the scan again. She said, "He's right. The tunnel density in the critical zone beneath the root systems is showing evidence of structural failure. The gophers aren't running from predators. They're running from their own tunnels." She looked at the oldest trees. When an underground tunnel system reaches a certain stage of failure, the animals that depend on it can sense it changing. They relocate before it collapses. She paused. "They can sense it before we can see it." Wren looked at the enclosure. She thought about 40 animals in a trailer, 4 days without food, staring through a rusted ventilation panel at a parking lot. She thought about what they had sensed when they were brought to this land. She thought about the animal that walked clockwise every morning and stopped at the corner facing the oldest orchard, and about all 40 of them standing at the eastern fence line in the evening. facing the drainage ditch, facing the direction of something they had understood before anyone with equipment had confirmed it. She said they knew. Amos said yes. She said before the radar, before the probe, before I found the map. He said that is what hunger teaches. It teaches attention. It removes everything that is not attention. He looked at the enclosure. They were starving, and starving animals have nothing left to pay attention to but the world directly around them. They hear things that fed animals filter out. He paused. I told you, hungry animals notice things full stomachs ignore. Dr. Pruitt was looking at her monitor. She said, we need to talk about what happens next. What happened next was the lawsuit. It arrived 8 days later, delivered by process server to the gate of the Callaway place, on a morning when the temperature had dropped overnight and left a thin frost on the windshield of Wren's truck and on the top rail of the enclosure fence. The complaint was filed by Sutton Agri Holdings, LLC, a registered Texas agricultural holding company. It named Wren Callaway as the respondent. The cause of action, framed in 17 pages of careful legal language, was described as the reckless harboring of dangerous wild animals in proximity to neighboring agricultural operations, constituting a public safety risk and a diminishment of property values in the affected area. The attorney whose name appeared at the bottom of the filing had a firm address in Houston. Wren read the filing twice at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her. Then she called Amos. He arrived within the hour. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and read the filing with the slow thoroughness of a man who has read many documents and learned not to trust the first impression they create. He set it down. He said, Sutton Agri Holdings. She said, I didn't know he had a company. Amos said, he's had the company for 11 years. It's a land acquisition vehicle. He purchases distressed agricultural properties and converts them to industrial lease agreements with national producers. He said it without looking up from the document. He has 42 properties in 4 counties. Yours would be 43. She said, how do you know this? He said, because I went to the county records office the morning after you signed the care agreement at the auction. I wanted to know who was making phone calls in the parking lot before you'd finished signing your name. She looked at him. He said, I have been watching things a long time. I know what a man who is watching property looks like when he is watching property. She said, he knew about the pipeline. Amos was quiet. She said, that's what you think. He said, I think it's worth finding out. The 1940 survey records are public. A company that acquires agricultural properties in this county would have reviewed every public record associated with every property they targeted. He looked at the filing. If they found the survey map with the irrigation line marked, they would have known about the Gopher Corridor potential. They would have understood that the orchard was vulnerable to exactly the kind of underground failure that was developing. And they would have known that the property owner dealing with that vulnerability, without knowing its cause, would eventually reach a financial position from which selling became the only option. She said they were waiting. He said, I think they were waiting. She said, and then I brought home 40 animals that started pointing at the thing they were waiting for. He said, I think that is approximately what happened. The court hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks from the filing date. In the interval, the ecological situation at the Callaway place continued to develop in ways that did not wait for legal proceedings to resolve themselves. Dr. Pruitt returned twice with the GPR equipment. On her second visit, she brought Terry imaging system that produced a 3-dimensional model of the underground space beneath the critical zone. The model was in the opinion of the graduate students who were in their late 20s and had studied soil structure long enough to have calibrated their reactions to it remarkable. The tunnel network was larger than the initial scan had suggested. It extended beneath 4 additional rows of trees that the first scan had not covered. The structural integrity of the tunnel walls in the oldest sections had degraded to a point that Dr. Pruitt estimated carefully was within 1 or 2 significant rainfall events of triggering a cascade failure. She said if this section collapses under rainfall saturation, you could lose 8 to 12 mature trees in a single event. Wren said when. Dr. Pruitt said, it's not a question of if, It's a question of what hits it first. But the ecological trial was not yet approved. The 30 pages Wren had signed covered the care and maintenance of the animals in the enclosure. They did not cover the supervised release of those animals into an open orchard environment. That required a separate permit application, a separate review process, and the agreement of the State Wildlife Office, which was currently also processing the complaint filed by Sutton Agri Holdings and had placed both matters under what the compliance officer in a phone call described as coordinated review. Coordinated review meant that the lawsuit was slowing everything else down. Brenda Garland called on a Wednesday. She said, "I want you to understand that my office is not party to the Sutton filing. I want you to understand that the coordinated review is a procedural requirement, not a judgment about the merit of either claim." Wren said, "How long does coordinated review take?" Brenda said, "In typical cases, 4 to 6 weeks." Wren said, "The orchard doesn't have 4 to 6 weeks." Brenda was quiet. She said, "I know." She said, "I'm looking at what I can do, but I need you to know that what you're dealing with in that filing is not a standard neighbor complaint. This is a document prepared by people who knew exactly what language to use to trigger the longest possible review process." She paused. "Someone wanted this to take time." Wren said, "I know." She drove to the county records office that afternoon. She was not looking for what she had looked for the first time. The first time she had been looking for information about her land. This time she was looking for information about a company. The search took 2 hours. What she found was not hidden. It was the kind of information that is available to anyone who looks for it in the right order, which most people never think to do, because most people do not know that there is a right order. But Amos had spent a lifetime recording information and had told her when she asked him where to start that the answer was almost always the first document in the earliest available record. The earliest available record of Sutton Agri Holdings showed a property research report commissioned 11 years ago when the company had been evaluating potential acquisitions in Hidalgo County. Attached to that report as a supplementary document was a photocopy of a county survey. A survey from 1940, with a line drawn in blue that crossed the Callaway property from northwest to southeast. She sat at the county records table and looked at the photocopy. They had known. For 11 years, they had known about the pipeline. They had known about the vulnerability it created. They had watched the orchard slowly lose its underground integrity and had waited with the patience of a company that has enough capital to wait for the moment when the math would stop working and the family holding the property would have no choice but to sell. They had waited through Robert Callaway's last years, through his death, through Wren's 2 years of minimum payments. They had filed the lawsuit the moment the care agreement gave them a plausible legal mechanism to accelerate the process. And the mechanism had been handed to them by 40 starving animals that nobody in Hidalgo County had wanted. She sat with this for a while. Then she photographed every page she had found and drove home. Amos was at the enclosure when she arrived. He came most days now. He brought his notebook and his canvas bag, and he sat in a low folding chair outside the fence line and watched the animals and wrote things down, and Wren had come to find his presence at the enclosure as natural and reliable as weather. She showed him the photographs on her phone. He scrolled through them slowly. He said, "This changes the filing." She said, "How?" He said, "Because it changes what the filing is. It's not a safety complaint, it's an obstruction. They filed a safety complaint to delay an ecological process that would eliminate their reason for wanting the property." He handed the phone back to her. "If the ecological trial proceeds and the animals stabilize the orchard's underground structure, there's no distress sale, there's no acquisition, there's no 43rd property." She said, "Will a judge see it that way?" He said, "I don't know." He was quiet for a moment. "But I know someone who might be able to help." That night, Amos fell ill. She did not know about it until the following morning when the call came from a number she did not recognize. A nurse at the Regional Medical Center in McAllen. She said that Amos Crofton had been admitted the previous evening. She said that his condition was stable, but that he would be in the hospital for observation for an unspecified period. She drove to McAllen. She was not family. She was not officially anything to Amos Crofton, not in any legal or administrative sense. She was a 22-year-old woman who had met him 11 days ago in an auction parking lot and had in those 11 days come to rely on him in the way you rely on certain things that appear to be external to you but are in fact carrying some of your weight. She sat in the waiting room for an hour. She could not see him. She drove back to the Callaway place. She parked and sat in the truck for a while without getting out. The court hearing was in 2 weeks. The orchard was running out of time. The suspension notice was still technically active, though Brenda Garland had indicated informally that enforcement during the legal proceedings was unlikely, as long as the enclosure remained compliant. She had a file of photographs from the county records office. She had a notebook full of observations made over decades by a man she had known for 11 days. She had 40 animals in an enclosure who had, without anyone asking them, to point it at the precise location and nature of the problem that everyone else had missed. She got out of the truck. She went to the enclosure. In the late afternoon light, the animals were moving through their normal patterns. The one that walked clockwise in the mornings was still. It was at the eastern fence line facing the drainage ditch in the position it had been in when she found it alone at the edge of the mound 200 yards away. She leaned on the fence and watched it. She said out loud to the animal and to the empty space around her, "I know what you found. I need to figure out how to show everyone else." The animal did not respond. That was all right. She had not expected it to. She picked up the canvas bag from beside the folding chair where Amos usually sat. She opened it. She took out the notebook. She turned to the map he had drawn of the Callaway property in 1998, the map with the zones marked in pencil in the single sentence at the bottom. She studied the map for a long time. Then she turned to the last page of the notebook. She had not looked at the last page before. The last page was blank except for 5 words written in the same careful hand at the top of the page in ink darker than the rest of the notebook because it had been written more recently. 5 words, "Watch the quiet things first." She read them. She closed the notebook. She sat down in Amos's folding chair. The pecan orchard stretched south in the afternoon light. The trees were full. They were still full. From any reasonable distance, they looked exactly the way they were supposed to look. They looked the way they always had. But she knew now what she had not known 3 weeks ago. She knew what quiet cost. She knew how long something could be failing before the failure became visible. She knew that the proof was beneath the surface in the dark, in the connected spaces where things had been moving and changing for years, while everyone above the ground went about their business and assumed that what they could not see was not happening. The hearing was in 2 weeks. She had work to do. The 2 weeks before the hearing were the quietest of Wren's life. Not quiet in the way the orchard had gone quiet, which was the quiet of subtraction of things, leaving one at a time until the absence became the dominant sound. This was the quiet of a person who has identified exactly what needs to be done and is doing it one thing at a time without the noise of doubt getting in the way. She organized the county records photographs in chronological order and had them printed at the copy shop in McAllen on acid-free paper. She requested certified copies of the 1940 survey documents through the county clerk's office and paid the expedited processing fee with money. She moved from a savings account she had not touched since her father died. She drafted a timeline on 3 connected sheets of paper spread across the kitchen table, tracing the acquisition history of Sutton Agri Holdings from its founding 11 years ago to the current filing cross-referencing each acquisition with public records of property distress in Hidalgo County. She called Dr. Cassie Pruitt. Dr. Pruitt said, "I can prepare a summary of the GPR findings. Scientific testimony requires specific formatting for court presentation. I've done it before." Wren said, "I need it to be clear to someone who's never seen a radar scan." Dr. Pruitt said, "I know how to talk to farmers. I'll make it clear." She called Brenda Garland. Brenda was quiet for a moment after Wren explained what she had found in the county records. Then she said, "I want to see the documents." Wren drove to the regional wildlife office the following morning with the certified copies in a manila envelope and spread them across the table in the conference room while Brenda sat across from her with a cup of coffee she did not drink. Brenda looked at the 1940 survey photocopy attached to the Sutton Acquisition Research Report. She looked at the date on the report. She looked at the date on the complaint filing. She looked at Wren. She said, "This is a deliberate strategy." Wren said, "Yes." Brenda said, "You understand I cannot be an advocate for your position in a legal proceeding." Wren said, "I understand." Brenda said, "I can present factual testimony about conditions on the property as a state inspector." She looked at the documents again. "I can present the GPR findings as documented evidence of an ecological situation that predates your tenure on the property. I can present my inspection records showing the enclosure has met every compliance condition." She was quiet for a moment. "And I can note that the timing of the filing relative to the ecological trial approval request is a matter of public record." She did not say anything else. She did not need to. The morning before the hearing, Wren drove to McAllen. Amos was awake when she got to the hospital. He was sitting up in the bed with a pillow against the window frame and a view of the parking lot that he had improved by removing the curtain from the rod and propping the window open 3 inches, despite what Wren suspected was an institutional policy against propped windows. He looked smaller in a hospital bed than he had in a folding chair outside a livestock enclosure. But his eyes were the same. She set the canvas bag on the chair beside his bed. He looked at it. He said, "You read the whole thing?" She said, "Yes." He said, "The last page?" She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I wrote that last page the night I drove home from the auction, after I saw you sign the papers." He looked out the propped window. "I'd been carrying that notebook for 30 years. I'd filled most of it. There was one page left." He paused. "I thought if I wrote those words at the end, whatever happened next would at least have the right beginning." She said, "You knew my father." He said, "I knew him for 3 visits in the fall of 1998. That's not knowing a man. That's meeting a man in the right circumstances to understand what he was trying to do." He looked at her. He was trying to save a piece of land that had been in his family for 3 generations. And he came to me because nobody else in the county was interested in the question he was actually asking, which was the same question you're asking. She said, "Why didn't you come back after 1998? He said he stopped returning my calls in January of 1999. "I drove out to the property once. He was polite. He told me he had decided to approach it differently. He was going to go through the county extension office." He looked at his hands. The county extension office knew about gophers. They did not know about what happened when a gopher population found an abandoned irrigation corridor and expanded beyond normal threshold. That wasn't in any protocol they had. She said he never solved it. Amos said no. She said, "And then he died?" He said, "And then he died." He looked at her. He said, "I came to the auction because I'd been watching that property on and off for 20 years. I drove past it twice a year the way you check on something you left unfinished. I watched the canopy. I watched the hawk population. I kept notes in the back section of that notebook." He paused. "When I saw the foreclosure notice on the gate 3 months ago, I started attending every auction in the county because I knew whoever came to deal with that property was going to need what I had written down." She said, "You were waiting for me." He said, "I was waiting for whoever came." He looked out the window. He said, "I didn't know it would be his daughter." A pause. "I should have guessed. He told me she'd have the patience for the long work." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "I need you to do something for me." He said, "I know." She said, "I need you to write a statement about the 1998 visits, about what you found, about what my father was trying to solve." She paused. "The hearing is tomorrow." He reached past her for the canvas bag. He took the notebook out. He opened it to a blank section near the middle where he had removed pages at some point and left several empty. He said, "Do you have a pen?" She gave him one from her jacket pocket. He wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. When he finished, he tore the pages out carefully along the binding, the way a person tears pages from a notebook they have cared for over a long time, with attention rather than force. He handed them to her. He said, "Give these to whoever is presenting your case." She said, "I don't have a lawyer." He looked at her. She said, "I don't have the money." He was quiet. Then he said, "Then you'll present it yourself." She said, "I know." He said, "Present the timeline first. Make it visual. Get the documents into evidence before the other side can object to the characterization. Let Brenda Garland and Dr. Pruitt speak to the technical facts, and then give the judge my statement." She said, "What if it's not enough?" He looked out the propped window at the parking lot. He said, "I have been watching things a long time. Sometimes a thing that should be enough is not enough. That happens." He looked back at her. "But you're not asking whether it's enough. You're asking whether you did everything you could. Those are different questions." She stood up. She picked up the canvas bag. She said, "I'll write to you after, let you know how it goes." He looked at her. She said, "I want you to have something to read." He said, "All right." She drove back to Hidalgo County through an afternoon that had turned unexpectedly warm, the kind of warm that Texas produces in November, when it wants to remind you that winter is a suggestion rather than a commitment. The pecan trees along the county road had gone gold, and the light through them was the particular amber of late autumn in the south, and she drove through it with both hands on the wheel and Amos's written pages on the seat beside her, in the specific focused quiet of a person who has accepted that tomorrow will require everything they have. She checked the enclosure when she got home. All 40 animals. She walked the fence. She checked the water. She updated the log. She stood at the eastern fence line for a while in the cooling evening, watching the drainage ditch 200 yards away. She said out loud, "Tomorrow." No response. She went inside and prepared what she had to prepare. The Hidalgo County District Courtroom was not large. It had the specific institutional quality of a room that has been used for serious purposes long enough that the seriousness has settled into the furniture. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Adler, who had the quality of measured attention that belongs to people who have heard many versions of many situations and have developed through repetition the ability to hear what is actually being said beneath what is being said. Dale Sutton arrived with two attorneys from the Houston firm. He was dressed as Wren had never seen him dressed, in a dark suit that fit precisely with a tie and polished shoes, and he looked in that setting less like the man in the contractor's clothes who had laughed in a gravel parking lot, and more like what he actually was, which was a person with access to resources and the strategic patience to use them. He looked at Wren when she came in. She was wearing the cleanest clothes she owned. Her canvas jacket was on the chair beside her. She had her father's name in Amos Crofton's notebook pages and 3 months of compliance logs in a file of county records photographs, and Dr. Cassie Pruitt seated 2 rows behind her. Sheriff Lyle Reeves was also there. "I had come," he said when she thanked him in the hallway, "because county records are public documents, and anyone who has been a sheriff long enough has learned that when someone files paperwork to delay access to public documents, the reason is almost never the reason they give." He had pulled the original 1940 survey from the county vault himself and had it authenticated by the county clerk. It was in evidence before the proceeding formally opened. The Sutton attorneys presented their case first. It was well constructed. It cited the relevant statutes regarding dangerous animal care. It presented photographs of the enclosure and the property. It referenced Wren's financial situation and the foreclosure proceeding as evidence that the property lacked the resources to maintain the required safety standards. It was the kind of argument that works when the other side has no documents. The other side had documents. When it was Wren's turn, she stood at the respondent's table and she presented the timeline she had drafted on the 3 connected sheets of paper, which she had mounted on a piece of foam board from the craft store in McAllen. She presented it the way a person presents something they have organized with care and understand completely. She walked through Sutton Agri Holdings' acquisition history. She presented the research report with the 1940 survey attached. She presented the certification from the county clerk showing the date of the report and the date of the complaint filing. She presented the GPR data as summarized by Dr. Cassie Pruitt. Dr. Pruitt testified for 22 minutes. She was, as she had promised, clear. She explained the tunnel network in language that anyone who had ever worked agricultural land could follow. She explained what failing root structure looked like on a radar scan and what it meant for mature trees. She explained the timeline of the colonization relative to the pipeline discovery that the research report documented. She said with the measured precision of someone who has learned to say only what she can support, the ecological situation on the Callaway property predates Ms. Callaway's tenure by at minimum 15 years and is directly associated with underground infrastructure that is documented in publicly available county records dating to 1940. A company that reviewed those records prior to filing this complaint would have been aware of the vulnerability that infrastructure created. The Sutton attorney objected. Judge Adler looked at the document with the acquisition research report on it. She said the document is in evidence. Overruled. Brenda Garland testified for 18 minutes. She presented the inspection records. She presented the compliance logs. She stated clearly and without elaboration that the enclosure had met every condition of the emergency care agreement on every inspection date without exception. She stated that the ecological trial application had been filed through proper channels before the complaint was received, and that the timing of the complaint relative to the application was a matter of documented record. She said one additional thing. She said, in my 15 years as a state wildlife inspector, I have not seen an emergency care situation managed with this level of documentation by a sole operator. I want that stated for the record. The Sutton attorney objected. Judge Adler said overruled. Then Wren asked Sheriff Reeves to confirm that the 1940 survey, certified by the county clerk, was the original document from the county vault, and that the document attached to the Sutton Acquisition Research Report was a photocopy of that same survey. Reeves confirmed both. He said it with the particular economy of a man who has been a law enforcement officer long enough to know the difference between what needs to be elaborated and what needs only to be stated. Last, Wren presented Amos Crofton's written statement. She read it aloud. It described 3 visits to the Callaway property in the fall of 1998. It described finding the same underground conditions that Dr. Pruitt's radar equipment had confirmed more precisely. It described Robert Callaway's understanding of what he was dealing with and his efforts to address it. It described the 40 years of fieldwork that had produced the observations that, now read in sequence, described the exact progression of the ecosystem failure that the orchard had been experiencing. The last paragraph read, I have spent my professional life watching what happens when the underground systems of an agricultural property are compromised without anyone above the ground knowing why their land is failing. The Callaway property is not an accident or a consequence of neglect. It is the result of a hidden infrastructure that created an ecological vulnerability over decades. The animals that Ms. Callaway brought to this property detected that vulnerability before any human with instrumentation could confirm it. The question before this court is not whether those animals pose a safety risk. The question is whether the company asking the court to remove them knew before they filed their complaint that those animals represented the only available mechanism to address the problem those animals found. Judge Adler read the statement twice. Then she looked at the Sutton attorneys and she said, I'd like to hear your response to the document showing your client commissioned a research report that included the 1940 survey prior to the filing of this complaint. The response lasted 11 minutes. It was thorough and it was professional, and it did not successfully explain why a company that claimed to have no prior knowledge of the ecological conditions on the Callaway property had commissioned a research document that included the map of those conditions. Judge Adler let it finish. Then she said, I'm dismissing this complaint. She said it without preamble. She said the documentation presented by the respondent establishes a pattern of behavior that is inconsistent with the stated basis of this filing. The ecological conditions on the Callaway property are documented and long-standing, and the proposed solution involves state-supervised wildlife management. There is no demonstrated safety risk in the enclosure. There is a demonstrated ecological risk on the property that the proposed trial is designed to address. She looked at both tables. I'm also noting in the court record that the timing of this filing relative to the ecological trial application warrants review by the county attorney's office. That is not a ruling, that is a referral. Dale Sutton was very still. He was still in the way a person goes still when they have been in situations like this before and have learned that the moment of stillness is the moment to assess rather than react. He did not look at Wren. He looked at the table in front of him. Then he gathered his documents and he stood and he walked out of the courtroom ahead of his attorneys and the door closed behind him. And Wren stood at the respondent's table with her hands flat on the surface and felt the weight of the morning leave her shoulders in a way that was not triumphant and not dramatic and was instead simply the absence of a pressure that had been there for several months. Dr. Pruitt put her hand on Wren's shoulder from the row behind. Sheriff Reeves nodded once from the aisle. Brenda Garland was filling out forms at the table where she had been seated with the specific, focused attention of a person who has something she wants done before the room empties. She came to Wren when the form was complete. She said, "This is a state wildlife office approval for supervised ecological release trial on the Callaway property." She set the document on the table. "This has been in process. Today's ruling removes the procedural hold. I'm approving it now." Wren looked at the document. Brenda said, "You have a 7-day window to begin under observation. I'll be there." Wren drove home through the warm November afternoon and did not stop until she reached the gate of the Callaway place, and she sat at the gate for a moment with the engine running and her hands on the wheel before she drove through and parked beside the equipment barn. The orchard was the same as it had always been from the outside. Full canopy, intact rows, the light through the leaves the way it had been her whole life. She got out of the truck. She went to the enclosure. She stood at the fence line. She said out loud to the 40 animals moving through their late afternoon patterns, "Tomorrow." The next morning, Brenda Garland arrived at 7. Dr. Pruitt came with 2 of her graduate students, both of them carrying monitoring equipment and the specific expression of scientists who are present at something they will write about later. Rufus Van was standing at the fence line between his property and Wren's. I had been there when she came out of the house before first light, before it was fully dark in the cold pre-dawn air of a November morning that had returned to being a November morning after the warmth of the previous day. I was standing with his arms folded on the top rail of the fence. He had a cup of something hot in one hand that was producing a slow curl of steam in the cold air. He did not say anything when she came out. She looked at him across the fence. He looked at the enclosure. Neither of them spoke. He had come, and that was enough for both of them. Later, when the graduate students had set up their equipment, and Brenda Garland had reviewed the release protocols, and Dr. Pruitt had run the final baseline scan of the critical zone, Wren went to stand near the enclosure gate. She looked across at Rufus, still at his fence rail arms, still folded. He still did not speak. His face was the face of a man who is watching something he does not yet know how to describe who has come because something pulled him there, and he has not yet decided whether to admit it. Wren opened the gate. 4 animals were let through the management gate into the supervised corridor that extended along the southern fence into the first section of the orchard, a section enclosed on 3 sides by temporary fencing that the graduate students had spent 2 days installing. The 4 animals stepped into the corridor. They did not hesitate. They did not look around with the confused attention of animals placed somewhere unfamiliar. They moved directly and without ceremony, noses close to the ground in the direction that every radar scan and every soil probe and every morning observation from a folding chair outside a livestock enclosure had been pointing for 3 months. They reached the first old tree. One of them disappeared underground, then another, then 2 at once. The corridor went quiet. The graduate students were watching their monitors. Dr. Pruitt said softly, "There." On the radar monitor in real time in the underground network of tunnels and chambers that had been growing beneath the Callaway orchard for 20 years. Something was happening that the equipment was not quite designed to capture, but captured anyway. The way good instruments sometimes record things they were not built to see. Movement. Fast. Deliberate. Following the corridor of the old irrigation pipeline from west to east. Then 30 yards away from where the first animal had gone underground, the earth moved. Not dramatically, not with the violence of something collapsing, with the specific controlled force of something being used precisely, a small eruption of loose soil at the surface that meant an occupied tunnel was no longer occupied, that what had been in it had been removed. A badger surfaced. It had something in its mouth. It was gone again in 2 seconds. Dr. Pruitt said, "Mark that location." Her graduate student marked it. In the next 40 minutes, Wren stood at the edge of the supervised corridor and watched the ground erupt and subside and erupt again in a pattern that moved steadily east, following the line of the old survey map with a precision that no one had asked for and no one had designed. She watched hawks she had not seen over the orchard in 2 years appear from the south in ones and twos and begin to circle. She watched a red-tailed hawk take a position on a fence post at the eastern edge of the property with the settled ownership of a bird that has returned to a hunting ground it did not intend to leave. Rufus Van had not moved from the fence. He stood with his arms folded and his coffee going cold in the November air, and he watched in complete silence the way certain men watch things that are reordering something inside them that they did not know needed reordering. He had not said a word since she came out of the house. By noon, Dr. Pruitt's count was at 83. 83 active burrow locations where the surface had been broken, where the tunnel structure had been compromised, where the long-term damage to the root support system had been interrupted. By sunset, the number was past 100. And at sunset, something happened that Wren watched in silence with her hand on the fence rail and her boots in the dry November grass. The pocket gophers came out. Not one, not a few. The earth at the eastern edge of the property, at the border of the drainage ditch, 200 yards from the enclosure, opened up in dozens of places at once, and the animals that emerged were not running from predators. They were running from their own failing tunnels, from the darkness that had been their highway and their city and their entire world, which was now collapsing around them as the support for its ceiling was removed one section at a time. They poured from the ground in the low golden light. They poured out the way water pours when the thing holding it back gives way at last in a rush that was neither dramatic nor orderly, but simply natural. Simply the movement of a great many living things following the only direction available to them. Rufus Van said very quietly from the fence, "Lord." It was the only word he had spoken all day. The red-tailed hawk came off the fence post. An owl, which had not been in the orchard in long enough that Wren had stopped expecting it, came from somewhere in the old canopy and was suddenly overhead. The balance was returning. Not all at once. Not that evening. The return of what had been lost would take months, and some of it would take years. And some of what had been gone might not come back in its original form, because ecosystems are not machines that return to factory settings. They are, as Wren would think about later, something more like a conversation that gets interrupted and then resumed, in which what is said after the interruption is not the same as what was being said before, but is still the same conversation. But the beginning of the return was there in the low light of a November evening in Hidalgo County, Texas, and it was visible from the fence rail where Rufus Van stood with a cup of cold coffee in his hand and something on his face that had not been there in the morning. 3 days later, he came to the gate with an old shovel over his shoulder. He said, "My northeast quadrant has the same problem your orchard has. I talked to Dr. Pruitt." She confirmed it. Wren said, "I know." He said, "I'd like to be part of what you're doing." She said, "All right." He said, "I laughed at you." She said, "Yes." He was quiet. He said, "Your daddy would have laughed at you too, probably. At first." He looked at the orchard. "And then he would have asked you to explain it, and when you'd explained it, he would have walked out there and looked at the ground and thought about it for a while, and then he would have said, 'Let's try it.'" He looked back at her. "That's what he did with everything." She said, "I know." He put out his hand. She took it. That evening, Wren sat at the kitchen table and wrote the letter to Amos. She wrote it on paper from the notepad her father had kept by the phone, the same notepad she had kept in the same place since he died, because it seemed wrong to move it. She wrote 3 pages in a handwriting that was messier than Amos's, but carried, she thought, the same intention. She described the hearing in full. She described the GPR monitors and the count of 83 and the hawks returning and the gophers pouring out of the eastern ditch at sunset and the particular quality of that light. She described Rufus Van standing at the fence all day in silence and saying one word. She wrote the last paragraph carefully. She wrote, "The hawks came back today. I don't have a photograph yet, but when the first one landed on the fence post at the east edge of the property, I stood there and thought about you sitting in the folding chair outside the enclosure all those mornings with the notebook. I thought about the note on your door. I thought about my father asking why the land had gone quiet and you knowing the answer and waiting 24 years for the right person to come and hear it. The hawks came back. I wanted you to know that." She sealed the envelope. She took a photograph of the red-tailed hawk on the fence post that she had taken on her phone at the end of the day. She printed it at the equipment barn printer on a piece of copy paper. She folded it and put it in the envelope with the letter and sealed it again. She mailed it the following morning. 3 days later, the hospital nurse called her at 7 in the morning. She said that Amos Crofton had received the letter and had read it twice and had asked the nurse to bring him a single piece of notepaper and a pen. The nurse said, "He wrote you something." She said, "He asked if we could mail it." She read it over the phone. The notepaper said, "Your father planted those trees. You only made the land remember how to hold them. Watch the quiet things first. Always first." That was all. He did not sign it because she would know who it was from. He came back every day for the next 2 weeks. He worked the eastern section of his property's fence line. He talked to Dr. Pruitt about his northeast quadrant. He called his neighbor to the south, a woman named Delilah Foster, who ran an operation that was 3 times the size of the Callaway place, and told her what he had seen. Delilah Foster drove over the following Friday and walked the orchard and did not say much, but made an appointment with Dr. Pruitt for the following week. The word moved the way true things move in farming communities, which is along the fence lines and across the roads and through the conversations that happen beside trucks and parking lots and feed stores. The conversations that sound like they are about one thing and are actually about another, about whether a piece of information can be trusted, about whether the person carrying it has earned the right to be believed. Wren had earned it. She did not know she had earned it until it became evident in the ways these things become evident in the steady accumulation of trucks that pulled into the Callaway Drive on Saturday mornings, in the phone calls and the applications that Dr. Pruitt started receiving from orchard owners in 3 neighboring counties who wanted to understand what was happening beneath their trees. The winter came in. The ecological trial continued under observation. The graduate students from Texas A&M became a regular presence on the property. Brenda Garland came for inspections every 2 weeks and left without requiring any corrections. The county attorney's office opened a review of the Sutton filing timeline that moved at the pace that county attorney offices move, which is deliberate but forward. Dale Sutton came to the gate on a December morning. He came alone. His truck was the same truck he had driven to every inspection, the large one with the clean contractor's paint. But he drove it up the gravel drive slowly, and he stopped at a distance from the equipment barn rather than at the gate, and he got out and took his hat off. Wren was at the enclosure. She saw him. She walked to him. He said, "I owe you an apology." She said, "Mr. Sutton." He said, "I know what you're going to say, that you don't need it, that you've already moved past it." He looked at the orchard. "That might be true, but I'm saying it anyway because I've spent 30 years believing that every failing piece of land was a business opportunity, and I forgot at some point that the land had people on it who were attached to it." He looked at her. I got reminded. She said, "Is that an apology or an explanation?" He said, "Both." He reached into the truck and pulled out a rolled set of drawings. He said, "I've redesigned the drainage systems for 6 properties in this county. Properties I was evaluating for acquisition. I put the ecological corridor recommendations in. I don't know if their owners will use them." He held out the drawings. "I also requested that the county attorney suspend the review. Whatever was done with the filing was done on my instruction, and the county shouldn't spend resources on it." She took the drawings. She looked at them. They were good drawings. Whatever Dale Sutton was and whatever he had done, he had spent 30 years learning how land and water work together, and the drawing showed it. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because watching 83 gopher tunnels collapse in an afternoon while hawks came back to a piece of land that hadn't seen them in 2 years is a thing that gets inside you." He put his hat back on, even if you came to watch it fail. He got back in his truck. He drove down the gravel drive and turned onto the county road and was gone. Wren stood with the drawings for a moment. Then she went back to the enclosure. She called the hospital that evening. The nurse said Amos was having a good day. He was reading. He was resting well. Wren said, "Please tell him the contractor came by today." The nurse said, "Anything else?" Wren said, "Tell him the orchard is holding." She called him every 3 days after that. The conversations were short, the way conversations between people who have understood each other quickly tend to be short without the length that is required when a thing needs to be explained. They talked about the animals and the monitoring data and the slow southward spread of the predator population as the gopher density in the critical zone continued to drop. They talked about Rufus Van's northeast quadrant and Delilah Foster's property and the 8 other operations that had reached out to Dr. Pruitt. They talked about spring. Amos did not make it to spring. He died in his sleep on a Monday morning in the second week of January at the hospital in McAllen at the age of 86. The nurse who called Wren said he had been comfortable, that he had been reading the previous evening, that the end had been quiet. She drove to the hospital. She sat in the parking lot for a while. Then she drove to the property. She walked the orchard in the cold January morning, the full length of every row from the equipment barn to the southern fence and back again. The trees were dormant now, their branches bare against a sky that was the pale, flat gray of a Texas January, and the ground under her boots was solid in the way ground, goes solid in the winter, with none of the hollow quality that the GPR had found 3 months ago. The tunnel network in the critical zone had collapsed and filled naturally as Dr. Pruitt had said it would. The root systems were reestablishing contact with stable soil. She could not see this, but she knew it was happening. She walked back to the equipment barn. She sat on the overturned feed bucket that had become her thinking seat since she was a teenager. She held the canvas bag in her lap. She opened it. She took the notebook out. She turned to the last page. 5 words. Watch the quiet things first. She looked at them for a long time. She thought about the piece of note paper from the hospital. She had it in the pocket of her canvas jacket. She had kept it there since the nurse read it to her over the phone. She took it out now and unfolded it and held it beside the last page of the notebook. The handwriting was the same careful hand that had filled the notebook for 30 years, that had written her father's name in 1998, that had written those 5 words the night after watching her sign her name in the gravel lot of a county livestock auction. She folded the notepaper back and put it in the pocket over her heart. She put the notebook back in the bag and stood up and went to the enclosure. All 40 animals. She stood at the fence for a while without speaking. She said he said to watch the quiet things first. The animals did what animals do, which is to say they continued their own concerns with the complete and unself-conscious focus of creatures who do not perform their attention for an audience. But the one that had walked the clockwise circuit every morning was sitting at the southern fence, facing the orchard in the position it had held on every clear morning since the beginning. It was watching something she could not see, watching with the attention of a creature that has learned in the specific way that hunger teaches that the most important things are often the things you have to be very quiet to hear. Spring came early that year, in the second week of February, when it had no particular reason to. The oldest section of the Callaway pecan orchard put out new growth. Not on one tree, not on 5. On the entire northeastern corner of the oldest grove, the section that Dr. Pruitt's initial scan had shown as the most severely compromised, the section with the deepest tunnel colonization and the most degraded root support, the section that Wren had walked past every day for 3 months, while it looked exactly the same as it had always looked. The new growth was small. The buds were smaller than her thumbnail. They appeared overnight the way certain things in nature appear, without the visible stages that would allow you to track the process of their arrival. simply present one morning in a way they had not been the morning before. She was walking the rows at first light when she found them. She stopped at the first tree. She stood with her hand on the bark for a long time. She did not cry. She had not cried since the night her father died, which was also the last time she had stood in this orchard in the dark, in the cold with her hand on an old pecan tree, and understood that she was going to have to figure out how to carry something that had always been carried by someone else. She did not cry. She just stood there. She called Rufus Van. He came in 10 minutes in his old truck and his work clothes, and he walked the northeast corner with her in the early morning and crouched down at the base of 3 different trees and looked at the new growth with the specific attention of a man who has grown things for 40 years and knows what new growth means when it appears in a section that had been failing. He stood up. He said, "The ground under here is different." She said, "I know." He said, "I can feel it through my boots. It's different from my northeast quadrant." He looked at the row of trees in front of them. "Mine isn't there yet." She said, "It will be." He said, "How long?" She said, "Dr. Pruitt says another season, maybe 2." He looked at the new growth on the old tree. He said, "Your grandfather planted these." She said, "My great-grandfather. My grandfather expanded them." He said, "And your father tended them." She said, "Yes." He said, "And now you." She said, "Yes." He was quiet. He said, "I owe you something." She said, "You don't." He said, "I told you that you had more nerve than sense. I said it across the fence the day you brought those animals home." She said, "You were right." He said, "I was wrong about which one mattered more." He looked at her. "Sense can be learned. Nerve has to already be there." He looked back at the trees. "Your daddy had it. I should have recognized it in you." He walked back to his truck. He stopped at the gate and said without turning, "I'll be here Saturday morning. Bring me the drilling map Dr. Pruitt drew up for the northeast quadrant. I want to start on the drainage redesign." She said she would. He drove away. She stood in the orchard for a while after he left. She thought about Amos, about the 40 years of observations in the notebook, and the 1998 visits, and the careful handwriting, and the 5 words on the last page, and the one sentence on the piece of notepaper that she kept in the pocket over her heart. She thought about her father, about the 3 visits he had made to a retired wildlife rehabilitator in the fall of 1998, because the land had gone quiet and he did not know why, and about the diagram that Amos had drawn of the solution that Robert Calloway had never gotten to use. She thought about 40 starving animals in a rusted trailer in a county auction lot, staring through the ventilation holes at a world that had decided they were not worth the trouble. She thought about hunger, about what hunger teaches, about the things you can hear when you have removed everything that is not attention. She walked back to the equipment barn. She picked up the canvas bag. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her. She thought about what to do with it. The answer came to her the way answers sometimes come, not all at once, but in layers. The way the soil gave up its secrets to the radar, one material at a time. She would keep it. She would bring it out when the time came. When a young person stood in front of her with a question that she recognized because it was the same question that had been asked on this piece of land since before she was born, the question that her father had asked, and that Amos had spent his whole life learning how to answer. She would put the notebook in their hands. She would let them feel the weight of it. And she would tell them to open the back cover, and she would watch them read the 5 words. And she would say those words belonged to a man who spent his life watching what most people walk past and what he saw save this land. She was 45 years old when she finally understood all of it. She was sitting in the equipment shed on an overturned feed bucket, in the same position she had sat in since she was a teenager, with the orchard visible through the open door, the full and living orchard that had cost her 3 months in a court case, and 40 animals, and the notebooks of a man who had been waiting 24 years to hand them to the right person. The young man from Texas A&M was sitting across from her with Amos's notebook in his hands. He looked up. He said, "You never thought it would work." She said, "I thought the land was telling me something. I thought the animals were confirming it. I thought Amos knew what both of them were saying." She paused. I didn't know if it would work. I knew it was the only thing that made sense. He said, that's the same thing. She looked at him. He said, knowing it makes sense. That's the same as believing it will work. She thought about that. She said, maybe. She looked at the orchard. Outside in the late afternoon, the hawks were moving through the upper branches. The owls were already calling early from somewhere in the oldest section of the grove. A coyote had crossed the creek bed that morning for the first time in years, and she had stood at the kitchen window and watched it move along the water and felt the specific quiet pleasure of a thing returning to where it belongs. The 40 animals were no longer in the enclosure. They had been transferred over 2 years to protected rehabilitation facilities and managed conservation sites across South Texas, wherever the wildlife officials had needed them, and wherever the ecological conditions had matched what the state program had documented at the Callaway place. They had each gone where they were needed. That was what they had always done. The young man set the notebook carefully on the table between them. He said, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Do you think he knew, when he wrote those 5 words, that you'd be the one who found them?" She thought about this for a long moment. She thought about an 86-year-old man in a folding chair outside a livestock enclosure watching animals that no one else had wanted, recording their behavior in a notebook he had been keeping for 30 years. Waiting with the patience of a person who has learned that the right moment to hand a thing on is the moment when the person who needs it appears. She reached into the pocket of her canvas jacket. She took out the piece of notepaper from the hospital. She unfolded it and set it on the table beside the notebook so the young man could read it. He read it. He read it twice. He looked up. She said he wrote that 3 days before he died, on a single piece of notepaper in his hospital room. He asked the nurse to mail it. She paused. He knew I would understand what he meant. He knew that anyone who had read the notebook and listened to the land and found the new growth in February would understand exactly what he meant. The young man looked at the 5 words in the notebook and then at the one sentence on the notepaper. She said, I think he wrote those words because they were true, and he wanted the last true thing he put in the notebook to be the most useful one. And I think he knew that whoever found them would be someone who had already learned the hard way exactly what they meant. She folded the notepaper. She put it back in her pocket. She said, now you hold the notebook, not me. She pushed it across the table. The young man looked at it. He did not pick it up. Not yet. He said, what am I supposed to do with it? She said, the same thing he did with it. Add to it. Watch things. Write down what you see. Carry it with you when you go somewhere that needs what's in it. She paused. And when you meet someone who is asking the right question and doesn't know it yet, you put it in their hands. She looked at the notebook. She said, that's the whole instruction. That's everything he taught me. The young man picked it up. He held it the way people hold things they sense are heavier than they look. Outside, the owls called from the old grove. The hawks settled for the night. And the land which had been listening all along was quiet, in the way land goes quiet when it is full and resting. The way it goes quiet when everything that should be in it is in it, working in the dark, the way roots work, the way water works, the way the small and necessary things work below the surface, beyond easy sight, steady and patient, and doing what they have always done. That is the whole story. That is what was under the ground.